Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Kristen Startup, a principal in our human capital consulting practice at Deloitte. And we are pleased to join you today to share a little bit about our perspective on Productivity Plus, as we call it. We've recently done a research study that we're going to share with you to talk about how the measures of productivity today are outdated and need to balance some additional metrics and opportunities in order to really get a full grasp of the way in which we should measure what we now refer to as Productivity Plus.
Awesome. And nice to meet you all. My name is Ronnie Gottesdiener. I'm a senior manager in our human capital practice, and I focus on the digital workplace. In my work, I think about the ecosystem of tools that our organizations use to drive employee experience, and specifically in today's conversation, the role that technology, productivity, and experience play for the workforce.
So let's dive in a bit. We know that today's workforce and the work that we do is changing. And organizations need a way to rethink how they can help their people thrive in this age of AI enabling and partnering with us in the work we do. We know that up to 45% of routine work can now be automated using AI. However, just a very small percentage of complex tasks can be automated. But we also heard that 33% of workers say they feel more disconnected and don't have human interaction as much as they crave or used to because of AI being introduced in their world. And so AI is becoming more and more intertwined with workers, and it's really changing that experience, that lived experience and how they're showing up to their jobs and their work every day. And it's often, though, these silent and unnoticed impacts that are really causing the most challenge in the way they do work and productivity. What we're seeing is, in a typical day at work, it's often that we're multitasking. We are joining and jumping in and out of meetings, possibly on multiple platforms. We're collaborating with others on another platform. We may be joining and collaborating and talking to each other on instant messaging. And that multitasking or that context switching can really interrupt productivity. It's often mentioned that up to 40% of a productivity loss can be attributed to context switching. And so how are we then able to think about the opportunity to really rethink how we're measuring productivity from those norms in today's world?
Thanks, Kristen, for outlining the challenge that we see in the market. So those challenges that Kristen just outlined kind of were the inspiration for this productivity research study that Kristen mentioned. We engaged over 800 employees, and when we say employees, we mean knowledge workers, deskless workers, or frontline workers, hybrid workers across almost 30 industries in the United States to understand their perspective on the role of employee technology, AI, experience, and productivity. We'll talk about the findings of that research in more detail in the subsequent slides, but coming out of the research, our team proposed this concept of Productivity Plus, so we want to anchor on before we dive in. When we use the word Productivity Plus, this refers to a wide range of business outcomes that a modern digital workplace enables. This includes productivity, innovation, inclusion, connection, collaboration, purpose, engagement, and beyond. And I think it's important to discuss the idea that this is different than maybe the traditional way that we've historically described productivity, really an output-based definition to an outcome-based definition. And the reason why we think it's important is because the output-based definition of productivity does not help us understand the experience components that drive our employees to be their most productive selves. So we'll talk again about the data, the statistics, the findings, but before we go into the numbers, I want to talk about, I think, two key points from the research that if you were to leave today would be the two things that I think are most important that we as a group remember. The first is that productivity and experience are mutually amplifying. They have a mutually amplifying relationship. So to kind of explain this in a simple example, think about a day at work where you've, I don't know, had a great working session or cleared out your inbox, whatever you feel like is the most productive thing that you could have done that way, you typically close your laptop and head home and you feel happy. Like you're like, oh wow, I was really productive today and I'm feeling happy. And on the other side, when you go into work, maybe you're feeling energized, you were able to go take a meeting, a walking meeting with your manager, or you were able to spend your day the way that you wanted to, you oftentimes are more productive. You spend a little bit more time on your deliverable, or you have, that extra boost of creativity to come up with a new exciting proposal to bring to your management. That's that mutual amplifying impact that we believe we see with productivity and experience. And again, we have the data that proves it. The other thing that I want to talk about is that organizations should intentionally leverage solutions to create that meaningful digital experience. And so again, like as Kristen mentioned, we're seeing an influx of AI solutions. There's no hiding that. But as we talk about those unlocks to productivity, we really suggest that organizations think about creating that intentional mix to drive that meaningful experience. So now let's talk about the numbers. There are kind of two key findings here that I want to talk through. The first is that 34% of workers surveyed are not satisfied with their workforce experience. And 89% of the workforce surveyed believed that being happier and more satisfied with their workforce experience would allow them to be more productive. Again, that mutually amplifying relationship between experience and productivity. The second finding here is that 53% of workers surveyed are not satisfied with that investment that their organization is making in digital workplace and AI and generative AI technologies to optimize their productivity, while 68% of workers surveyed believe that a better digital experience with tools they use would help enhance their productivity. That second point on the last slide around intentionally investing in solutions to create that right mix and drive that digital experience. So again, these findings really have kind of underpinned this idea of productivity plus for our thinking at Deloitte, and again, something that we're really seeing our clients and our employees feeling in their day-to-day. One other thing that I want to call out before we move on to the trends in the research is what we mean by experience at Deloitte. I think sometimes the term experience can be defined differently. And so when we talk about experience at Deloitte, what we really mean is the sum of a human's lived experiences at work. And we have components of workforce experience that we think about. The work that someone does, the place that they do work, the people they work with, the sense of belonging they feel, their well-being, their connection to the mission. And when we talk about digital experience, we want to think about how the digital workplace can enable or amplify those set experiences. Although I wear a technology hat most days, I recognize that technology alone is not going to drive experience, but we do want to think about it as how it can enable as an enabler. So the trends. 4 trends coming out of the research that we've mentioned. Again, overall productivity plus, but what are those concepts that have gotten us to this proposed idea? The first, we've talked about it quite extensively, productivity and experience are mutually amplifying. Clearly, we see this one as important and a key takeaway for today's session. More data to back this up. Workers who are satisfied with their workforce experience are 2 times more productive than those who are not. These findings for us underscore the need for organizations to really focus on improving workforce experience components when thinking about solving the productivity problem or opportunity. The second trend is around the key to driving productivity is to think about the work itself. So when we think about the most impactful kind of dimension of productivity, it's really around the work that someone does, which maybe you think like, of course, that's obvious, but it's really thinking then around those interventions around work that we can introduce to help drive the needle around productivity. So 84% of workers indicated that they would be more productive at work if they could essentially structure their day around their working preferences. So then what does that mean? What can you do as a leader of your organization to help move the needle here? I think the first goes back to a data point that Kristen cited at the beginning around this work about work. So when we think about those low value, no value add tasks, that's where we see opportunities to introduce AI and generative AI to remove some of those barriers to allow our employees to be spending more time on those strategic working opportunities. The next is around kind of people and culture. Can we emphasize kind of the importance around building relationships and learning to empower employees through these valuable experiences, which then can in turn improve their productivity? And the third kind of factor for organizations to think about in moving the needle in this area is around well-being. Helping our employees and helping our organization culturally embrace this idea that you can find the right balance at the individual level to maximize working potential. The third trend here is centered on designing productivity levers at the individual level. So workforce needs and challenges should guide the productivity lever design. And what we mean by that is that productivity and the influences around that are not universally the same for each of our teams. Frankly, it's really thought at the individual level. So clearly, you're not going to be able to solve productivity for every single person, like one by one, desk by desk at the organization. But what we suggest is trying to understand what are some of those universal barriers that teams or departments are experiencing, and using those to help guide your, frankly, experimentation around lever intervention. Some of the barriers that we typically see are things around interruption, things around lack of communication, and frankly, lack of access to tools. So as you understand what those specific barriers are for those worker segments, you then have the opportunity to design workforce-specific interventions. The fourth trend really centers around the role of AI and generative AI in productivity. And when we think about this, we think about the idea that 64% of workers have indicated that access to effective AI and generative AI technologies will allow them to be more productive at work. Again, as I mentioned, technology alone is not the solution, but we do see organizations kind of playing in a digital playground to introduce these technologies where it makes sense for worker segments as an unlock for productivity potential. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Kristen to talk a bit about how we now think about measuring these productivity ideas.
Excellent. So as we said, our thinking is that in this new age of productivity plus, we should shift our thinking away from those outputs to outcomes. And the relationship between productivity, experience, and AI really becomes a differentiator in how we think about this. So how can we put something that's quantifiable against this experience and productivity plus? We know that leaders are still gold and measured on productivity. And so what we would suggest is a combination of those traditional output measures along with outcomes. Instead of measuring productivity of knowledge workers simply on the hours worked, for example, a more modern way of thinking about productivity for this cohort is really around this ability to balance their time to focus on the work of work or outcomes, as well as their time spent in cultural activities, well-being activities, and those activities that create that human experience and interaction within an organization and contribute to overall productivity and therefore engagement. We think that this metric can be better assessed using a lot of sources of passive data. Traditionally, this was an area that potentially we did a lot of surveying around and had individuals tell us how they are feeling about their experience, but there are now a number of capabilities, including information from solutions like IAMPHENOM, that can help us gather that sentiment. So we have a perspective around these 6 traits that we feel are important in assessing ability to balance that productivity measure. The first one is the opportunity around focus and deep thinking. Productivity increases no less than 6%, as Ronnie was saying, when people are working from home and they have fewer distractions, when they are able to structure their work situation in a way that allows them to feel the most individually productive. The second area then is collaboration. How can we spend time creating an environment that rewards and measures collaboration. It's oftentimes that employees can spend up to 31 hours in unproductive meetings a month. How can we reduce that time, create more collaboration in the flow of work so that we can contribute to that overall productivity? People and culture is another aspect that we feel is important in a new way of thinking about productivity plus measurement. Treating employees well and having engaged employees has always been known to be a significant contributor to employee engagement raising, which then drives customer satisfaction as your employees are engaging with your customers. And treating employees well has led through our data to at least a 3.2 times higher rate of stock, of revenue. So there are actual corollaries to business outcomes and ROI that can be demonstrated to your organization by starting to focus on collaboration metrics and people and culture metrics. The next area is well-being. Happy people are 12% more productive, as Ronnie was sharing. And so if you feel happy at the end of your day, if you feel that the environment that you are in creates a sense of well-being, a sense of happiness, then you are more likely to be more efficient and more productive in the work that you are driving on a daily basis. And the final area is that area of work about work. How much time are we spending on those tasks that Ronnie mentioned that really can be automated, that don't contribute to any value from a human taking on that interaction? On average, employees spend about 28% of their day answering emails. Think about that. That's a significant amount of time for things that are coming in on a real-time basis and are just very disruptive. And if we go back to that metric about context switching, every time that you're interrupted, if you're losing another piece of productivity, 1% productivity, you can see how quickly that 40% productivity loss is gained just by simply looking at email. So how do we move away from email as a primary channel of communication into a world where we have better access to collaboration tools that create that shared opportunity to learn together? So we think that organizations can leverage these elements of data to measure a productivity. But how do you then get a sense of good and bad, or good and more good? You can start by looking at different workforce segments. So how are knowledge workers in one department compared to another department? How are high performers compared to other performers in your organization? And you can start to see and expose trends, and you can identify areas that high-performing, higher productive employee segments are, and what access to tools do they have? What norms and ways of working are they using? So all of those will then allow you to start to assess ways that you can broaden the best means of these areas into creating more highly productive employees. So a few final takeaways before we wrap up to make this really tactical. First and foremost, as Ronnie said, this is not a one-size-fits-all. And while there are opportunities to think about this at an enterprise level, really identifying cohorts and workforce segments and what will be applicable to shared segments is where you're going to drive the most value. Ronnie mentioned this, you're not going to be able to address every single individual person's preferences and needs. That would be actually unproductive. So how can you create experiences and norms that apply across similar cohorts and drive those productive outcomes? The second piece around it is that there is a science behind measuring productivity with AI. And so if you're gathering this element of outputs as well as outcomes, then you can bring these things together, utilizing AI, allow it to do the synthesis of the data and the environment for you to then make those recommendations. When you are using generative AI and you ask it to correlate all of these different data sources, this analysis of data, the models can then predict for you or showcase for you what are the recommended norms without you having to necessarily do that analysis and make those assessments on your own. And then the final piece is that key variables need to be considered when measuring. So this goes back to what is it in those 6 areas that are going to be important? What is it that your organization is still going to require in terms of different types of industries using something like hours worked to drive productivity, or items produced, or orders filled. Those metrics are still important and will still remain. We're not suggesting that there is an opportunity to move away from those, given how inherent they are in business culture today. But there is an opportunity to think further about how you can build things together and bring this productivity plus conversation forward and really drive what's inherent in the workforce today and in the environment in which we're working for that opportunity to really get a better picture of your workforce experience and the overall productivity. So thank you for joining us for this conversation. We'll point you to the research behind this study if you're interested in more of the data, more of the analysis, and the way in which we came to this recommendation and this framework. I will say the data strongly correlates to the measures that we talked about. So if you're interested in how each of these influence, you can see some of that in the research. And we certainly would be happy to carry on the conversation in our booth for the rest of the week if there are questions that we can answer. And I think we're going to stay around. I know this is a really large room. I don't necessarily think we have mic runners. So if you have questions and want to come up and chat with the time we have left, we'd be more than happy to answer questions. So thank you all.
Thank you.